Now, that was verses 1 through 11. That was the verses that we actually covered before we went on break in the book of Exodus 21. Now, neither God nor Moses invented slavery. God nor does the Bible condone slavery, even though it is mentioned often in the Bible about slavery. The reason we see it often in the Bible is because God was making provision, or God was making laws to protect people from becoming slaves for the rest of their lives. And the reason there was slavery is because they had adopted it, or become used to, because of how they intermingled with pagan nations. Remember, they've just left Egypt, and they were slaves, actual slaves, not servants, slaves to Egypt. And so they have this mentality that it is okay, even though God never condones slavery. Now we're going to pick it up in verse 12 of chapter 21. So read along with me. Verse 12. He who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. However, if he did not lie in wait, but God delivered him into his hand, then this is God speaking, I will appoint for you a place where he may flee. But if a man acts with premeditation against his neighbor to kill him by treachery, you shall take him from my altar, so he may die. We see here the implementation of capital punishment. It still exists in today's time, but there have been made so many obstacles, so many delays in the way that capital punishment today is implemented. And God didn't want anybody to be delayed from receiving this punishment, not because God is cruel or was cruel or heartless. It was because God wanted to make sure that people will not break the law again, or that they will learn from the mistake of this person. God had given the law within their people, or Israel, as to how to implement this properly. There has to be a judgment. Now, this is not the first time that we see capital punishment being imposed, or God speaking about it. This goes back all the way to the book of Genesis. As a matter of fact, in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, when God was speaking to Noah and his sons after the flood, and letting them know that nobody was to take anyone else's life, or else that one person will be put to death. Now turn to the book of Romans with me. We're going to the New Testament and see what Paul writes about in Romans regarding capital punishment. In Romans chapter 13, verse 3. Romans 13, verse 3. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do you do what is good, and you will have praise from the same? For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. So Paul is writing in the New Testament that God has implemented this specific judges, specific people within the law of man to implement capital punishment, not because he is trying, or this person is trying to kill people for fun, but to punish the crime. So here's logical application of the sixth commandment. This is what we're seeing here, where it says in the sixth commandment, you shall not murder. and that is murder is premeditated killing, meaning they planned it out, they waited, they looked for a way to get to that person and eventually get rid of them. Now, there were times when there was an accidental death, and God made a way to receive a fair trial so that a person will not be punished if it was an accident. So he says that he would make or appoint a place for the person who was guilty or seemed guilty, so they would go until there was a judgment given to this person, for this person. However, after being inspected and investigated, if he was found guilty still, God says here, take him from my altar so he may die. In other words, get him away from here. He is guilty. Impose capital punishment so that he may die. Israel at the time didn't have, like we have now, NYPD or SAPD to implement these kinds of laws. So it was after the family members to implement or see it that justice was served. And oftentimes they couldn't find a judge, so they themselves had to know what the law was to implement this. Now let's keep reading back in Exodus 21, verse 13. And if he strikes his father, and he who strikes his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. He who kidnaps a man, I'm sorry, you know what, let me pause. I'm going to read verse 15 and address that verse and verse 17 together, and then I'll come back to verse 16. And he who strikes his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Then verse 17. And he who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. So both of these verses, verse 15 and 17, deal with the parents. The sixth commandment out of the 10 commandments addresses a person's mistreatment of his or her parents, abusing them physically, verbally, emotionally, and in some cases, spiritually. God was looking out for these people as well. The guilty child will be treated in the same way that in the verses that we covered in verse 12 through 14, where there will be a trial. There will be some place that they would be assigned to go, and eventually a trial was given to them. Now, as a child is growing up, this is why I brought up Proverbs. As a child is growing up, he or she needs to be taught self-control, self-respect, and respect for others. Those three things are needed, amongst other things, to be able to raise a moral, God-fearing child. Self-control, self-respect, and respect for others. Specifically for anyone who is an authority or an elder of that person. Because they're children, they're going to often try to push the limits. They're going to try to get away to see how far they can step out of bounds or step outside the boundaries that parents put in place for them. We Christians, we often do the same thing with God. We are his children. If you're a born again believer in Jesus Christ, then you are one of his children. All of us are his creation, but until you're born again, then you are one of his children. And if you, being a child of God, test the limits, then there are consequences. Now, he doesn't punish you immediately, but there are consequences. So he will allow you to deal with the consequences or the result of whatever that disobedience was. We call it natural consequence. Now, if a child does not respect the parent or his parents, her parents, they're most likely they're not going to respect authority. And if they don't respect authority, they're not going to respect most people, or probably no one. They're not going to respect people. Again, going back to Proverbs, this time Proverbs 13, verse 24. And it says, "He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves his son disciples him promptly." Let me read it again. "He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves his son disciplines him promptly." Now, it's not referring to a rod iron, in being struck in the back, or somehow with this iron in causing injury. It's speaking about discipline. Proper discipline starts early. Otherwise, when they get older, they'll rebel and it'll be more difficult. I am living proof for that. My father tried to discipline me too late in my age, and it didn't go well. And in the cases of some people, because they have no discipline, they have no respect for authority, we see this often in the news. They commit murder. I remember when I was in high school. Uh, this probably Well, I had graduated high school already, but I remember this classmate that used to be when I was there came out in the news as he had murdered somebody. And when he came out in the news, it wasn't. It was shocking to know that he did such a thing, murder somebody. But it wasn't a surprise because somehow we all knew that one day it was going to get to that point. He had no restraint. He was never restrained as a child. He had a rough upbringing too, and so for a lot of us, it was not a surprise to know that he had committed such a thing. But we were surprised that he did, in the sense that he killed somebody. A person killed somebody. Now look at Hebrews chapter 12. Speaking of discipline, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 11. Now, no chastening or no discipline seems to be joyful for the present. In other words, when it's happening, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Notice it doesn't say those who have been punished by it. It says trained by it. And it's discipline. It says here chastening. Some of your translation means discipline. Trained. It doesn't mean, take out your chancla and beat somebody with it, or take out the broom or whatever is close to you and whack the person next to you. No, it's talking about discipline. It's talking about instruction. and, and oftentimes it has to be repeated because children are not going to learn the first time. Just like you adults. We adults, we're disciplined by our father, but oftentimes we make the same mistake at least once or twice. So I hope it's just the most twice, and we learn from it. Now back to Exodus 21, verse 16. He who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he is found in his hand, shall surely be put to death. This is speaking of human trafficking. And human trafficking isn't new today. And it wasn't new at the time either when Moses is writing this. It has existed from the beginning of time. And God, for this is one of the reasons why he implemented capital punishment. Today, in our society, I'm talking about today, many states here in this country have made it legal for the kidnapping, or children being kidnapped by their own parents so that they can take them to other states and mutilate them, meaning the transgender movement, sometimes against the will of the other parent. I think a lot of us have heard in the news about one father or one mother who is imploring, is crying to the authorities, while the other parent is taking this one child, male or female, to be taken to another state so that they can have surgeries be done to change their gender. Now, a person does not fully develop cognitive uh, brain functions until approximately the age of 25, most of the time. For some people, it happens earlier in life. For some, it happens even later in life, but approximately the age of 25 is when they are able to make cognitive or sound and mind decisions. The age of 25. Why do you think that whenever you go or whenever they start driving, their insurance, the vehicle insurance goes up so high until after they turn 25? Because the insurance companies knows they can make uh, you know logical decisions when they're too young. So why would they make logical decisions when they're still under 18 and their parents are giving in to their request? We call such parents progressive, or rather, to be called progressive, they should be called regressive. They're going backwards. Okay, let's move on. Verse 18 now. If men contend with each other, and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die, but is confined to his bed, if he rises again and walks about outside with his staff, then he who struck him shall be acquitted. He shall only pay for the loss of his time, and shall provide for him to be thoroughly healed. To me, this sounds similar to workman's comp, or as I was saying earlier, car insurance, comprehensive insurance. If men chose to fight or pick a fight, they had to have the understanding that if they did so and they killed somebody or injured somebody, they would be responsible for that other person's, or the one that would be injured, to care for him or to restore his lost wages and to pay for his medical expenses until, it says here, he was thoroughly healed. So it wasn't no minute little thing to get into a fight. If you're getting into a fight, you have to have the understanding that somehow either you die, but if they die, you're responsible for their life. If they were injured to where they couldn't work, they couldn't care for themselves, and it was up to you to provide for them, for their expenses. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 1 says, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." All right, let's move on. Verse 20. "And if a man beats his male or female servant with a rod, so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be he has surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property." On the surface, this sounds cruel because somehow this person eventually is going to die. If God says here, well, if he lives 2 days and he's able to move around, but then later on he dies, then the master is not guilty. But it wasn't such a cruel thing once you understand the culture. And God created men, all men, humanity, to be in the likeness, in His image. And see, He didn't want anybody to be, whether they're believers or not believers, He didn't want anybody to be punished, to be mistreated. So He was making provision and consequences for those who were imposing injuries. But at the same time, He's protecting the master, because here we don't know what's the reason why the master is striking the servant or the slave. Now again, the Bible did not create and does not promote, condone slavery. This person that was being disciplined, or in this case it says that he was being beaten with the rod, if he was injured yet lived at least 2 more days but later on died, the master was not guilty. However, if he died within the first 2 days, then the reason why this master was probably beating him was too harsh, and so then he would have to deal with the consequences. Now it's often that this servant or the slave could have been defiant, could have been uh, trying to do something he wasn't supposed to do. Now it says here, notwithstanding, in other words, yet if he lives but then later dies, he's not guilty. Look at the end of the verse. For he is his property, or because he is his money. Remember, a lot of men will sell themselves over to a master because they owed money. So in other words, he's saying, you owe me money, you are my money. That's really what the verse says here. You're my money. Again, in Proverbs 10, verse 13, it says, wisdom is found on the lips of him who has understanding, but a rod is for the back of him who is devoid of understanding. Or in the NIV it says, of him who is with no sense, or is an unruly person. So in other words, discipline, but somebody was often, or not often, but could have gotten out of hand and taken it too far. Discipline, still dealing with discipline. If a servant was being defiant, this is one of the reasons why the master had not the privilege, but was allowed to impose discipline. But again, if they would take it too far and they would die within the first 2 days, then the master was guilty. It was believed that if they lived 2 more days or even longer than the 2 days after the beating, then it wasn't considered as murder, a premeditated murder, killing. Verse 22. If men fight, again fighting, and hurt a woman with a child, so that she gives birth prematurely, no harm follows, he shall surely be punished accordingly as the woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Before I deal with the actual text here, I'd like to point out how God in the Bible, speaking to his people Israel, and this is applicable to us too, he speaks to them about the importance of life in the womb. A life in the womb, whether it's 1 day, 1 week, or it only has 1 week or 1 day left before the child is born into this world, it's a life, period. It's important. Whether it's people call it a fetus. It's a life. And in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 30 specifically, God gives Israel, or is giving Israel, a choice between them committing sin and dealing with the consequences that would eventually bring death, or the choice of abiding under the laws that God has given them. And we're talking about the laws. But he before he finishes, God in Deuteronomy chapter 19, the latter part, he kind of whispers to Israel. He says, after telling them everything that could happen to them, therefore choose life. In other words, he's whispering, this is the right answer. This is what you're supposed to choose. Choose life. When we get there, we'll eventually look at it with more detail. Now, speaking of this pregnant woman, well, this pregnant woman, the wife of one of the men that were fighting, which God is addressing here, we don't know. We're not told here the specifics. And how is it that this woman is so close to where somebody is fighting? So I could imagine that these men, they just say they're in the middle of the street. Back in Israel, there's no traffic like we have traffic now. And one of them picks up, I don't know, a chair or a rod and throws it at the other one. And this pregnant woman just happened to be passing by, and it strikes her. That was possible. This is the reason why God put it in the Bible. So if it did happen, there was a way to deal with it. And in verse 23, the latter part, it says, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. In other words, there was a punishment. The men knew that something could happen. But if there was no harm that was brought to this woman, at least not to the point where there was a death either with the child or with the woman, the husband would say, well, you still need to pay. And then they would have to, the person would have to pay whatever the husband would agree upon. Let's move on, verse 26. If a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, he shall let him go free for the sake of his eye. And if he knocks out a tooth of his male or female servant, he shall let him go free for the sake of his tooth. Again, God is protecting the dignity of man, humanity, I should say. A master could not simply take it out on his servants. God is protecting them. God is not saying it's okay for you to treat them like dirt. That's not what God is saying. They're not an object. They're people. They're humans. They're made in my image. Verse 28. If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, then the ox shall surely be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall be acquitted. But if the ox tended to thrust with its horn in times past, and it has been made known to his owner, and he has not kept it confined, so that it has killed a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner shall be put to death. If there is imposed on him a sum of money, then he shall pay to redeem his life. Whatever is imposed on him, whether he has gored a son or gored a daughter, according to this judgment, it shall be done to him. If the ox gores a male or female servant, he shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. So this is clear. These verses are clear. If the ox or any other animal causes injury on people, the owner was not responsible for the injury. However, if this animal, speaking specifically of an ox, was known to have done it in the past, and the owner didn't restrain him, didn't do anything about it, then the master and the ox will be put to death, or he would have to pay a sum for his own life, but the ox will still be put to death. Now, this to us, or the way I see it here, is God is speaking about personal responsibility. Now, a lot of us, most of us, we don't have oxes that we care about or that we have in our backyards, but we have vehicles. So that could be considered an ox. If you're driving recklessly and you've been warned, you've been given tickets, you've been warned before, yeah, you still do it, it should be, according to God's law, it should be put to death. Now, that's not going to happen in today's time, but this is essentially what God is saying here. Verse 33. And if a man opens a pit, or if a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls in it, the owner of the pit shall make it good. He shall give money to the owner, but the dead animal shall be his. So, a lesson to learn here is that if you're digging a trench out in the field where there's nobody out there, but all of a sudden somebody who is on their phone with their face inside the phone happens to fall in it, then you're responsible. I know that's not going to happen, but that's pretty much what it's saying. You know, somebody would be digging a trench and would not cover it, or, you know, fence it off or somehow, and then an animal fell in there or a person fell in there, then you would be responsible for the injury of that animal or the death of that animal. It would be your responsibility. Again, God imposing personal responsibility for the actions or inactions that you caused. Verse 35. If one man's ox hurts another's so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and divide the money from it. And the dead ox they shall also divide. Or if it was known that the ox tended to thrust in time past, and its owner has not kept it confined, he shall surely pay ox for ox, and the dead animal shall be his own. All right, so again, going back to the animal, similar to the previous verses, uh, verse 28 to 32. If this ox, it's the first offense, kills another animal, then there is no punishment. Sell that animal and divide the money. And that dead animal's flesh or the meat, divide it as well. However, if this is not the first time it's happened, God says, kill that animal. And the dead animal belongs to the master of the first one. And sell it, but you, the master, do not get any of that money. Because you're guilty. You should have done something about this animal. Now, God, what He's doing in these verses, in this chapter, God is looking out for a farmer. A lot of farmers, even today, they have a lot of economic, hardships, because maybe there was no rain, there was no harvest. Sometimes there was not enough to feed the animals, so they were struggling. It's similar to today's time, farmers from today. And so what God is doing, He's looking out for these farmers. Now the next two chapters, chapter 22 and chapter 23, we will be dealing with more laws, justice, moral laws, and ceremonial principles, which God imposes. There are other laws still dealing with personal responsibility. And God is going to speak about the Sabbath later on. All right, let's pray.